Hello, you're welcome to this presentation on valuation and rates of return. So I have a three-series video on this topic, and in part one, I'm going to look at valuation in part one, and part one is going to look at how we value bonds. And then I have a second part which is going to look at rates of return. And here we are going to discuss the yield rate or the yield to maturity and the rates of return on, for example, on common stock and preferred stock. And then in my part three, I'll be discussing about valuation again, but in this part, I'll be looking at how we value preferred stock and also how we value common stock. So this is what we're going to discuss in part one, part two, and part three. So let's look at part one, how we value bonds. So when it comes to valuation of bond, and again, this is a continuation of what we discussed last week when we were looking at time value of money. If you recall, in the time value of money, what we did was to look at how we value or how we determine the present value and the future value of either a single amount or a series of payments. So let me just pick there and think about this. So in determining the present value, or the future value, we saw how we do this for either, again, a single amount or a series of payments, which we called annuity payments. And this could either be annuity due or ordinary annuity. The same thing for the future value. We determine how we compute the future value of a single amount and the future value of annuities, which again could be annuity due or it could be ordinary annuity. So my focus is really on the present value. So I'm picking up from this how we determine the present value of a single amount and the present value of annuity. So this concept is going to be relevant to us when we're discussing the valuation of bonds. So we know that a bond is a financial instrument that is promising to pay you a series of payments. And of course, when the bond matures, it also pays you the face value. So here, and I'm just going to give an example. So here is an example of some of the features of a bond. So when you buy a bond, you'll find a bond will have what you call the face amount, the face value, and most likely bonds are sold in denominations of 1,000. So let's assume you just buy one bond for $1,000. And the bond will also have the coupon rate, which sometimes we also call this the nominal rate, or sometimes we just call the stated rate. And for the sake for discussion here, let's assume this is 10%. And then the first will have maturity, which could be is a 10-year bond, so it's going to mature in 10 years, and any other features. So if you think about it, today is time 0, and then here is year 1, year 2, year 3, and you continue all the way to 10 years. So what the bond is promising you is to pay you 10%, which is based on the coupon rate. So it's going to pay you 10% of the face value. So the coupon rate times the face value gives you what the interest payment will be. So this bond is promising to pay you $100 every year. Again, assuming again this is compounded on a yearly basis, then the bond is paying you $100 every year because you have a 10% per year. If this was a semi-annual bond, if this bond was semi-annual, then it's promising to pay you interest payment every 6 months. If that's the case, then every 6 months it pays you $50. But that's not the case for here. We're assuming this bond is paying you interest every year. So we are going to use the $100 every year is what is promising you. And then at maturity, this bond is in addition to paying you interest at maturity time of $100, it is also going to pay you the face value, which is the $1,000. So the question we are trying to address in this part of our discussion is, what is the value of this bond today? And today is at time zero. Today is at time zero. What is the value of this bond? So if you have to buy this bond today in the market, how much are you going to pay for this bond? That's the discussion that we are trying to address. Now, a bond, just like any other instrument, the way we try to determine the value or the price of an instrument, we basically try to determine the present value of the future benefits from that instrument. The future benefits, or what we call the cash flows from this particular instrument, the bond, is the $100 every year plus the $1,000 that is going to pay you when the bond matures. So if you're a bond holder, then you'll be receiving $100 every year, and then at maturity, you also receive the $1,000. So the value of the bond today then should reflect the present value of these payments and the present value of the first value. So in other words then, and we know that from our previous discussion, the $100 every year represents a series of payments. Again, we just call these what? Annuity payments. And this comes familiar to us from what we discussed again in the previous discussion. And the $1,000 you're going to receive at maturity represents just a single amount. So again, this represents the single amount to be received again when the bond matures. So then it's very easy for us to determine the present value. And by formula, what you're seeing here is this part is representing the present value of the interest payments, the all interest payments from T1 all the way to T20. In this example, the I is the interest payment, which is $100. So the present value of the annuity. So the present value of the annuity plus the present value of the single amount, the $1,000 to be received in the future, and you add these two values together, and this value will give you the value, or what we call the price of this bond today. However, keep in mind we use the coupon rate. The coupon rate, we only use the coupon rate to determine how much the interest payment is going to be. And that's why I did 10% times the face value to determine the $100 each period. To discount this to the present, to determine the present value, what we do is we discount this interest payment and we discount the principal, which is the first value, we call it the principal. We discount that $1,000 in this example using a discount rate, the Y, and the Y is basically the market rate, or what you call the yield rate. In this example, I'm assuming the yield rate is going to be 10%. So if the yield rate is 10% and you discount all this payment, you'll find the value of this bond being $1,000. And I'm going to show you in the next slide. So let me just show you quickly how this works out. So here's an example, a simple example of a bond. Is a 10-year bond and it has a coupon rate of 10%. Again, this is an annual coupon rate. So you need, in other words, it's 10% per year. And the required rate of return is also 10%. So to determine the value of this bond, we could use again Excel to do so. We can use the financial calculator, you can use the tables, or you can use the formula. So what I want to do is, if you end up using Excel, then of course you just have to key in what your N is. It's a 10-year bond, so your N is 10, and the rate here is the market rate is also 10, and therefore you use 10 there to be your required rate of return. And your payment, it's $100 is the payment, which you are seeing here. That's, you insert the $100 as your payment, and the face value, this bond has a face value of 1,000. So at maturity, the bond will pay you again $1,000. And CPT compute the present value. This bond goes for $1,000 today. If you're going to use Excel, let me just show you quickly. So if you use Excel to do the same thing, so to compute the value of this bond, so what we are going to do, just quickly, let me just pick up one. And if we are going to use this to compute, so to determine the present value of this bond, so the present value of the bond, we know that our rate, again, this is the market rate, this is the yield rate. The yield rate is 10%. Keep in mind, we are going to uh, discount the cash flows using the market rate or the yield rate and not the coupon rate. A number of periods, we talk about 10-year bond, and the payment, again, we use the coupon rate to determine the payment. We know that the payment is $100. That's a cash flow, and the future value of this bond is $1,000. So the future value of the bond is 1,000. So at maturity, the bond will pay $1,000, and this gives us what the present value of the bond will be. So the present value of the bond is that, and let me just add something else here. So this is the let me call this the coupon rate. Coupon rate is 10%, and the yield rate, the yield is 10%, and the I'm going to put the, so we have those three, and this is now the present value of the bond. That's the price of the bond. So the present value or the price of the bond. Because I'm going to go back to here and explain what happens if some of these variables changes. For example, what about if the yield rate is not 10%, it's either more than the coupon rate or less than the coupon rate. So in that case, the nature of the bond, so the nature of this bond, again, I'm going to come back to this later on, but let me continue and then I'll come back to this. So this is where we are. So So what happens if we end up making some changes? So what happens if the market rate changes, or if the coupon rate was different from 10%? So remember, we use the coupon rate to determine the payment, the nature of the payments, and we use the market rate or the yield rate to determine the monthly, the discount, which is the present value of the bond. So keep that in mind. For example, if the coupon rate was different, then in this case, we end up changing the monthly payment to 130 because we're using 13% as the coupon rate. But remember, in our case, our coupon rate is 10%. So I won't focus so much on this because you're going to see changes in the market rate and not really a coupon rate, because this basically shows you end up buying a different bond that has a 13% coupon rate and the 10% market rate still remains the same. So I won't go into that, but let's assume there's some changes just to show you. If something changes, if the yield rate is going to change, because remember we said the yield rate will not remain the same. It's a market rate. It depends what the yield rate is for that particular day and week and so on. So there'll be some changes on the yield rate, and therefore, because of those changes, how do those changes then affect the price of the bond in the market today? So let me look at one scenario where the market rate goes up to 15%. How does this change the value of the same bond that has a coupon rate of 10%? So the coupon rate remains the same, but the market rate changes to 15%. So given that scenario, again, the present value of the bond, or the price of the bond, will be equal to the rate. Again, this changes to uh, 0.15 because we're changing the market rate. And then we're also the number of periods remains the same, 10 years. The payment remains the same as $100 because remember, the payment is based on the coupon rate, which is still 10%. And the future value still remains 1,000 because the bond has a face value of $1,000. So given that, the price of the bond will be selling for 749. So this is a bond that is selling lower than what the face value is. So this kind of bond, we are saying this bond is selling at a discount. And this bond that is selling same as the face value, this bond is selling at par. What about if the yield rate was, let's say, 7%? How does this change the price of the bond? Again, if that was the case, let's see what happens. So again, the market rate or the yield rate is 7%, and the number of periods are still 10 years. There's a 10-year bond. The payment is still $100, and the face value of the bond will still be $1,000. In that regard, then this bond, remember again, the coupon rate is the same. This bond is selling for 1,210, and therefore this bond is selling for more than the face value. So this bond is being sold at a premium. And to summarize this discussion of comparing the yield rate to the coupon rate, you see here is at par because again the coupon rate is the same as the yield rate. In this example, if the coupon rate is lower than the market rate, then the bond is sold at a discount. And if the coupon rate is more than the yield rate, this bond is being sold at a premium. So in summary, what we are trying to say is this. So in summary, I'm going to say this. Uh, the value of the bond is going to change over time. But the way it's going to change, at maturity, the value of any bond must equal its par value. So even though you bought the bond for 1,200 or you bought the bond for lower than the face value, the bond value is going to change over time, and therefore at maturity the bond will stay at par value. So if the required rate of return remains constant, then the value of the bond will the value of a premium bond would decrease over time until it reaches the $1,000, which is the par value. Similarly, for a discount bond, the value will increase over time until again it reaches $1,000. And for the par value bond, is being sold at par, so will remain the same all throughout the life of the loan, so long as again the required rate of return remains the same. So in summary, if you think about this from a graph perspective or a picture perspective, what we're trying to say here is if the bond was sold at more than the first value, over time, this value, the price of the bond is going to decrease until it gets to what? The $1,000 at maturity. And a bond that was bought at a discount, the value will keep on increasing until at maturity this bond reaches the $1,000, which is the face value of the bond. Again, it's just an application of the time value of money to determine how we value the bond. So just keep in mind, the takeaway from this is just understand that once you've figured out the interest payments, which again you're going to use the coupon rate times the face value, and that gives you what the payment plan look like for that particular bond. And then you determine what the yield rate for that bond is for that particular day, and use that yield rate to discount the payment, the annuity payments, and also the face value of the bond. And remember what we have said here, our discussion here has revolved around where this is an annual bond that is paying you interest every year. If this was a semi-annual bond, if this bond was paying you interest every 6 months, then keep in mind, if you're going to use even a Excel or even a calculator to work out this, then make sure you're going to change the N. So if this is a 10-year bond and it's paying you interest every 6 months, then your N is not 10, your N then will be 20. And in terms of your interest, it will not be 10% because you have 2 periods per year. Then this will change your I, and your rate here will be basically 5% if it was paying you interest every 6 months. If this was on a quarterly basis, again, you'll just do the same thing within the previous chapter by saying, then you'll end up changing the number of periods to reflect that, and you'll also change the rate to reflect that. Those are the only things you have to remember in terms of the changes you're going to do. In terms of the payment, it will also change the payment. So if this was a 10% per year, but it's paying you interest every 6 months, then the interest will not be $100. The interest will be $50 every single period, which in this case will be every 6 months. So keep that in mind if the rate is a semi-annual bond, or it's going to be on a quarterly basis. Most likely bonds are always either semi or it's going to be on a yearly basis. So I hope the information helps, and I look forward to seeing you in the next discussion where we are going to pick up the trying to understand the yield to maturity, or the yield rate, or the required rate of return, because here we know it's given to us, it is 10% or it's 13%. How is that 13% derived? What factors reflect that 13%? will be our discussion for the next chapter, for the next presentation, which will be part 2 of my series. So see you in the next series. Bye bye.